Hello and welcome everyone who has joined so far. So today's webinar is a training session. We're not going to do a build along, but we will do adding or managing physical records by box in Laserfiche. And we're going to use a couple products here today. Go ahead and cover that here. Now, while we're doing any of this, or I'm showing you any concepts here within the demonstration during our webinar, go ahead and please post your questions in the questions box. We'll take a look at those either during the webinar or at the end of the webinar, and we'll try and answer as many questions as possible in the time allotted. So for some tips for success for any of you who want to write down notes, go ahead and feel free to write your notes down, take screenshots if you want, ask questions in that question box as I mentioned, and we do have a survey at the end. So we do look forward to hearing from you regarding your questions and the way you feel about the webinar as well. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do that. And by the way, this will be recorded, as I mentioned before, and we'll post it up on our YouTube channel. Just look for CDI or Cities Digital on YouTube, and you'll find all of our videos that are currently up there, including past webinars and build-alongs. Today's a webinar, not a build-along. So today's process, we're going to look at adding physical records management to Laserfiche. Laserfiche does have digital records management if you have purchased the Records Management Edition, but the concept of physical records management using Laserfiche is kind of interesting, and we thought we'd present that here today. So the intended audience for our webinar here today are records managers who might want to see a potential way to manage physical boxes, and experienced forms users who might be building some of the methods that we are going to be using today. So the requirements for physical records management. For those who have forms on-premise, you'll need Forms Professional because we will be using SQL database lookups, and you'll need a SQL database to make some of this work. If you're using cloud, you already have Forms Professional, and then cloud uses lookup tables, not SQL databases, to do the same thing. I've actually built the demonstration here in Laserfiche Cloud, but you can build it in either environment to great success. You also need to be, if you're going to do any kind of records management, you'll need to make sure that you have those rights, or we can set it up with a workflow so that you don't need any of the rights. The only rights you really need as a records manager is for disposition of the records at the very end of their life cycle. So that might be something you need. Otherwise, we can actually automate almost everything with Laserfiche workflow. What will you need access to build out this solution? Well, first off, obviously the Laserfiche repository, so you can see the representation of the physical boxes. You'll need to be able to access and design Laserfiche forms for certain features. You'll also need the Laserfiche administration console in order to build either templates or fields or both to make your solution work. And I did the same here. I had to create a new template and some new fields so that we could track information about the boxes that we are managing physically. If you're in the cloud, you'll need cloud repository access, and you'll need to be a Laserfiche Cloud Process Administrator. That is not by default given to users, but it is a setting that is a option for end users. So in cloud, you need to set that on your account in order to implement some of these features. All right, so our agenda here is to demonstrate pretty much the solution. I'll walk through just the use of it, and then we'll take a look at how this was implemented. The records transfer process is fairly straightforward. We will either have a new box that we're creating, and we need to get a barcode for the box that we can put on the barcode. We also need to set up where it's going to be stored physically, and then also create an entry in Laserfiche, basically a records folder in Laserfiche that has all that same physical identifying information, the box name or description, the location, and its records properties so that we can manage that, so that if we transfer it out for, somebody comes in and says, hey, I need that box 3100, we can mark it as being out and put a hold on that so that it does not get destroyed if it were to come to that. And then we can transfer it back in as well. So there's going to be 3 different scenarios here in our demonstration. So why don't we take a look at our demo right now? All right. So an initial demonstration of this built solution before we look under the hood to see what is going on here. We'll go ahead and take a look. So we had 3 scenarios, right? We have new box that we need to put documents in and then store in our warehouse or whatever. And if it's already an existing box, maybe somebody has come in and says, hey, you know what, I need the documents in box X. I need to check it out. And you can do we call it a transfer, but you could call it anything you want. And or you can transfer a box that had been checked out already. We could check it back in. But let's create a new box. Let's say you have new documents. You can put it into a box and then put it up on a shelf in your storage facility. So let's go ahead and walk through how that looks. On this form, some simple radio buttons with some hidden and dynamic fields here so that we can choose what's going on. So if it's a transfer in, yes, and is it a new box? Well, we can say, yes, it's a new box. If we were transferring in an existing box, we could actually scan the barcode and it would confirm. For example, maybe you've got a box in the system. It'll confirm that for that warehouse, you go to that room, S01, look for aisle 2, bay 2 on shelf 3, so that you can walk that box in there. Now, if it's a new box, you can actually do all the setup here as you wish. You will give the box, for example, a description or a name. This will be what shows up in the repository. So, for example, we'll go and call this webinar test. You can probably hear my keyboards in the background. Choose your warehouse from the list. You might have more than one warehouse location. I made up a location here. You might have several different rooms. I only have one room in my demonstration here. We have different aisles 1, 2, and 3. So we have a couple different aisles. Let's choose aisle 1. We could choose, well, it's kind of preloading bays for me, but this might be a choice. You have several, maybe 2 different bays on each aisle. Could be more than that, it just depends. Choose your shelf, 1, 2, or 3. And then within the repository, we do want to choose, for example, some way of identifying the cutoff instructions and retention schedule. I have chosen to use the disposition authority numbers in a database so that it can look up what those cutoff instructions and retention schedules might be. You could use another method in your database. It doesn't have to be tied to a DAN number. It could be a record number, it could be a series number, whatever record types, which you've built yourself so that everybody has a knowledge of what kind of document that is. So the identifying information isn't really important. I just happen to have chosen a disposition authority number that links to a very unique set of cutoff instructions and retention. So at this point, we would simply submit this form. It's really simple for anybody who's at the warehouse or a records manager. We can just simply submit that form. All right, and that form then finishes up, and we then would take a look in our repository. And in my repository, I have a physical records management folder. We'll go ahead and hit the refresh button and see how that folder looks now that it's been created through the form. So remember, we gave a description of webinar test, and we have I guess we'll call it a box number that has been generated in the background on the database. And so that's just the next number in sequence. We can do anything by, you can get more sophisticated than that. I just happen to generate a sequence number. So we now have a record or a box. And if we click on that box, we notice first we have our fields, and it's got our template with our box number, DAN number, and all the location information in the fields. And on the records area, we have the cutoff instructions, retention schedule, and the ability as a records manager. And this is where that role of or privilege of records manager on your account is important, because unless we're doing some workflow to apply event dates, which then allows us to cut off records, you would simply be a records manager managing this folder with the setting of the event date, and then you could cut the record or the box off. And this is an example of Laserfiche's new flexible records management. You don't need record series since version 10.4, and we're up to 11.0 currently. So I've used that capability here to create a record folder in a normal record folder, or not just in a normal folder, right? So we have this interesting looking icon, and it's a records folder. What's interesting, it even says it's a folder icon in there. So now this is all in the cloud. And so now it's named it, puts its box number on there, and we have our field information with our box number as well. Okay, so now what else did that do? Well, because we just created a new box, we want to make sure that it has a barcode on the box. We want to apply a barcode so that every time we check it in or out, we have that available to us. And in the background, I was provided with a form. I got an email that said, hey, here's this new barcode. Go ahead and print this out. You can print this form as you wish, and then you can use the barcode on there to scan that box in or out, or in other words, transfer it in or out. You can submit or just leave it open. We might even put the box number on here. I just let the barcode exist here, but we could have another field on this form that shows the actual box number as well. And the whole idea with this barcode form was I wanted to print it out and show on my cell phone, by joining the same session from my cell phone, to display the scanning of the barcode through the field. And I'll show you that in a moment here. So that would be something you could print out, and then maybe if you want to cut it out or just paste it onto the box, that's okay. You can customize this form, and we can even sometimes hide the comments box there and the submit buttons. We can use some JavaScript and CSS to make this printout a lot more just user-friendly to the box, let's say. And that way you can have that box with a barcode on it, tape that to the box, and you can use that from then on. Just check it in or out. So now we've got a box here, and it's currently just, it's not on hold or anything like that. And so at that point with our process, we could then go to the same form, go back a step here. And this time we'll do a transfer out. Let's say somebody comes in and says, hey, you know what? I need that box, and we could use our mobile device. You could use a barcode USB wand at your computer and scan that barcode in there. To scan out or transfer out a physical box, we would use the form and select out. And with the mobile device, we can use a barcode to read in the ID. Scan the barcode. Barcode is now in the box ID. Click anywhere else. It then confirms your box ID number. We'll then submit so that we can check out the box. You'll now see that the box number 12005 has been marked with a hold because it's been transferred out. We don't want to take care of we don't want to delete the box by accident while it's still out. At this point, we'll transfer that box back in by selecting Transfer In, choose Existing. It'll preset our date, but we can change the date. Go ahead and scan our barcode. Again, it confirms the box. With our form submitted, we should now see that the folder will be removed from hold and is now checked back in. All right, so how did all this get built? So one, there's a form. There's two forms involved in this process. And why don't we take a look at the way we built that. So under process automation, this is where we go to build the forms. For in cloud, it's kind of a neat little thing. We have tasks. That's where the printable form might show up in your task inbox because you submitted the transfer in for a new box. It'll come, the printable form for the barcode will show up in your task box, and you can see that. To build the form itself, we went to process automation. But those who have seen Laserfiche Forms Designer, this should look familiar. Within process automation, we have many different options in the cloud. It's a little bit more split apart in an on-premise environment, but you do have your workflow designer tool, which is a Windows application. Business processes in the cloud really is the forms process system in your on-premise environment. We have data management in the cloud, which is really your, could be on-premise, it could be your SQL database. In cloud, they call them lookup tables. So for example, you might go to our data management and look at our records system. And we've got, as we see, when we did that lookup, we have our different box numbers and the location information for each of those box numbers. So this is a lookup table. It takes the place of your SQL tables in a database. All right. The other items available to us are rules, and this ends up having to be something that you need to build in the cloud. For example, we have quite a few different lookup queries in order to basically do some of the fill-ins on the form. It's a little different than the cloud, so it more involved steps. But for example, we might want to find a list of all of our box IDs, or for inserting new box, we might have a database lookup that says, okay, that being said, what's our information in that database? And let's go ahead and just do a update of the information into the table. Or we can do lookups based on certain criteria. So in this case, I've labeled all these PhysRM, or physical records management, and these are database lookups and database functions. We have insert or select, and your SQL tables and SQL information is a lot easier with Laserfiche workflow. You can actually build a lot of the work that I have to do here in these queries. We can build it all in workflow in the on-premise system. So trust me, it's a lot easier if you're doing workflows on-prem. The reason why I built this, little side note, I did build this in the cloud because I did want to demonstrate it from my phone, because my phone can gain access to the forms online. But my GoToMeeting doesn't want to let me do that, so I wish I could show that to you, and that's why it's in the cloud. On-premise, it would be a lot simpler because you just have workflow activities that did updates or insertions or lookups into a database, and you wouldn't even have to build any of these table queries, for example. So you have, as we saw, the lookup table, but then you also have the queries here as well. Okay, So you might have to build out different queries for things to do. We can package this up to a certain degree, but it's kind of a custom solution depending on how you want to name your lookups and all that. The concept should be easily replicatable, if that's even a word. But that's going to be some of the underlying functionality to make some of these forms work like we do. So for example, on our e-form, when we say, hey, let's go look up an existing box and fill out that information, it should retrieve that information and fill it out. Well, that actually was a lookup for the existing box ID based on that number. Go look up and display and pull all that information back in the form. Right, so that was, if we look at our business processes and our most recent item that we had just built, that's our webinar business process. We'll take a look at that. So this is the underlying form process with its different workflows to be run. So the submission is made, and whether it's a create new, transfer in, or transfer out, it'll run a different workflow for us as part of that. We then have our form. So the form is right here. We have one form, and it has some field rules. But the form itself has the radio buttons for in or out. We've got our new or existing choices, and then different sections to show or hide based on our information. And as you can see here, we've got some default values like the current date and the username. That way we can send a notification to that user that they have a printable barcode form if they're creating a new box and going to store a new box. You can make some of these fields required. I should have made all of them required, but just for testing, I made just a couple required. The DAN number certainly would be required, and some of these fields are read-only, as you might have seen, so that you just choose your number and then it fills in the value so that you can see what it is, but you don't need to edit that as displayed there. All right. Okay. So this is Laserfiche Forms on the cloud. There's a question of what version. Forms cloud is, I think you could, if you're used to the on-premise version, cloud actually kind of runs about 3 months or 1 quarter calendar-wise ahead of the on-premise version. And that would be, well, this was probably 11 point something. So it should be fairly similar to 11.0 or even 10.4.1 or 10.4.2. You should be able to do all the same functionality in this version or a version that you have, if it's at least 10.4. But the forms information and concepts that I'm using here will work just fine for even earlier versions of Laserfiche Forms. You don't need anything special on that particular version of Forms. Okay, so we filled out some fields. On some of these, we've got our box. And for users who want to scan a, let's hit done. Where are we at? Transferring back in. So on this field, we should actually allow it to accept a barcode scan. So when you're using a mobile device, it will access your camera. Okay, so if you don't do that, you won't be able to scan anything. You'll just have to type in a number of the box. But if you enable the scanning of a barcode, that integrates the form with your mobile device's camera. And then you just point it at the barcode. It will read the barcode, insert that barcode in this field for you, because really just a barcode is a number and that field is just an input box for a number. You could type it in, you could scan it in by barcode. It's the same thing. And it should then allow you to do anything else you want. Let's see, let's also double check and make sure this field also is accepting barcodes. So there it is. Yes, it is. All right, and then you just save your updates. How did those fields behave? Well, we built some field rules so that the different sections show depending on your choice. So for example, the transfer in section will show when transfer in or out radio button is set for in, or show the transfer out section when the transfer in or out button is set for out. We've got some rules here that just show or hide various parts of our form. Okay, and you can have multiple conditions to allow us to show one section. As we see down at the bottom here, we have to have both is it existing and transfer in to show the existing box being transferred in section, which you saw right here. So we're doing a transfer in of an existing box that shows the existing box being transferred in section. If it's new, it hides that and shows the new box section instead. If we're doing a transfer out, there's only one section. So do that. And obviously, I need to clean up some of my field rules, because if you had already chosen a new box, but then did a transfer out, it actually leaves the new box section in there. So my field rules are a little incomplete. So watch out for that. The field rules can be very interesting. So on the new box, maybe I have to also add a compound statement so that when it says new, we also have to make sure that anything else is not displayed as well. So some rules that need to be in place. Then we'll leave that for the moment. We have some lookup rules. So remember, we had a field where, hey, we're going to transfer in an existing box, and it pulls that information from the box ID, which we scanned via barcode. Well, how do you do that? Well, at least in cloud, the lookup has to be, to pull back that info. Here's the rule. And there is a lookup table query that had to be built prior to using it in the form itself. This is really interesting in Laserfiche Cloud. Now, on-premise, we just do it in workflow. We don't have to have any pre-built queries. We just build the query in workflow and let, or actually the lookup is just of the information straight out of the SQL database, and we don't have to build any intermediary lookup. It's just, hey, take the information and show it based on some of that info. So it's a lot easier in this lookup rule when it's on-premise. In the cloud, we have to build a underlying query to provide that same functionality. And in this case, we're just using the scanned barcode box to look up in the box ID barcode field on our lookup query. That's the name of the input parameter to the query. And then it returns warehouse, room, aisle, bay, and shelf. Pretty straightforward, but it's just an additional step we end up having to do in the cloud as opposed to the on-premise system. So you might have several more than these. These were all the ones that I built for the functionality here to show today. I did theme the form. We just used a logo, some colors, and you can have custom themes, or you can use pre-built themes. You can change that out. Maybe you want to do that. Pretty garish there, but here's our pre-built saved custom theme. And you can customize it with your own logos, etc. And then save that, and you're good to go. Let's see. Now, I did use, we'll leave that. We won't actually make any changes. For some of the fields, we have a 2 per line. That allows us to display some of those fields side by side. So, for example, if we looked at the layout of this form, we have the transfer in date and the transferred in by. But if we notice, those are side by side. So that CSS allows us to do that in a form that's built in the what we would call the classic forms designer. There is a new forms designer which allows us to lay out these fields by just placing them side by side in the designer, and we don't have to do any tricks like using a CSS class to make these fields show up side by side. So that might be useful. However, here's a big warning. Both on-premise and on the cloud, if you build a form using the new form designer, they call it the form designer as opposed to the classic. The classic includes JavaScript at the moment. The new forms designer, even though it's easier to lay out the fields side by side or however many you want on that same line, it does not include CSS and JavaScript. So if you need to do fancy tricks like creating barcodes with a CSS or other JavaScript actions, use the classic designer like we see here. Okay, very handy to know. Okay, let's see. And then having built all that out, we then might have a, at least on the process, we then submit that form. Let me take that here. And if it's a new box, we have our workflow that we call, and that just inserts it. And we're passing a lot of information to the workflow. All the warehouse location information, a username, we might hard code that. We might pass the DAN number and the retention schedule information dynamically depending on what you chose. And then that workflow will then create the entry in the repository, and if need be, if it's a new box, also send a or start a new forms process in there. And in fact, it might be useful even to take a look at that workflow. Take a look at that real quick. And this is the way it looks in cloud. You won't see this on premise. You'll have your workflow designer Windows application that you'll be using. And if we take a look at the workflow that was built here in the cloud, or that I built, we'll be able to see that it's going to, if you want to follow along, it basically looks up for the existing box numbers in the system, and then will, in this formula, take the maximum number, the highest number in that list of box numbers, and then add 1 to it. If you wanted to see that in the cloud, we can open up that selected rule, and we've fed it a group of numbers, and then it will generate a, from the input of all the IDs, it'll then do a max calculation, go, okay, what's the biggest number in there? And then add 1 to that so that it adds another box in there. So you could test it if you want. You could say, hey, well, here's our box numbers that already exist, and do that. And what's the next box number? Well, it should be 12,004, and under testing, it generates 12,004. And that can be, that'll then be fed back into any process after that. So we have our next number. We can then, at this point, check and see, hey, does this number exist, or is the selection on the form new? I chose to create, hey, this is a new box. So we can then invoke another form or business process. In this case, I called it printable barcode, and it's going to feed the username and any barcode numbers that you might want to generate. I kind of hard coded this one, but it could be dynamic. Every time it looks up that formula, it should feed in whatever that number is, and then you'll have a new printable box. Create your folder in Laserfiche, assign the metadata to that, and then based on what was selected, I only have 2 choices here, but it would be probably a bit wider with more cutoff instructions to choose from, because you then have to assign the particular cutoff instruction to your documents, and also assign retention schedules to that folder as well. And so these 2 cutoffs and retentions, that's how we found the document that had the, we go look at our, oops, we'll click on this and look at our repository. That's how that folder ended up with the records management properties. So we'll go look at our physical records management folder. There's our folder that it created, and it ended up with those field values and the records properties assigned to it. In this case, communication received and provided, which matches the document. And we could even add that information to the box here as well on the form. If you wanted to see what the DAN number is, maybe we'll maintain the DAN number, which we should be maintaining for this particular box as well. So that's another upgrade you could add to the form and add to your table in the background as well. Okay. So that is our demonstration here today on our physical records management processes. So really want to thank you all for your attendance. We have lots of resources available to us and you can use as well. Answers.laserfiche.com, which you can access if you have a support account, which is free for all Laserfiche users. You can sign up for a free account, and then there's the Answers forum. Questions can be posed there. Some of the information that we did today, not necessarily this particular solution, but many others exist under the Solutions Exchange or Solution Exchange website that Laserfiche maintains, which are nice articles about how a particular Laserfiche user has solved a particular business problem. You have the support site as well for other information. If you want to reach out to us for any questions relating to working on building something yourself, you can reach out to consulting@citiesdigital.com. If you need to purchase additional software or are interested in finding out how much something costs regarding Laserfiche, reach out to sales@citiesdigital.com. If you are having technical support type issues, we are available here at support@citiesdigital.com. Again, my name is Kyle Niebel, software trainer here at Cities Digital. If you have any specific questions of me, my email is kylek@citiesdigital.com. And that concludes our training session today. I want to thank you all for your attendance.